Hello, everybody. I know many of you, but not all of you. My name is Dan Wagner, and it is a real pleasure to introduce our guest speaker today for the fifth, is it Deep D? Fifth or sixth? Sixth ICT for D seminar. Seventh. It's getting almost beyond my ability to count. Speaker in our series on ICT for D. And Daniel Andler is a professor and chair of philosophy of science and epistemology at the Université Paris-Sorbonne. And he was appointed in 2007 to the very prestigious Institut Universitaire de France. I've known Professor Andler now for what, 5 years, something like that, in some areas of common interest, one of which is ICT for D, but also in the general area of cognitive science, where he has moved from his early days of being a mathematician and philosopher to trying to, what would we Americans say, dabble in the real world of education and, in this case, technology. He has been active in a number of interdisciplinary areas in social sciences and philosophy in France. And in about 5 or 6 years ago, he started a think tank called Compas. And in some sense, this is a reciprocal visit because I got to make a presentation to the Compas group at the École normale back, I guess, 2 or 3 years ago. And we decided at that point that it would be great if he could ever make a trip to the United States. And he's combined this with other visits here in the US. And we are very pleased to have him here today. I know that his title that you can see, Technology in the Wild, I don't know why he changed it from the original French. The original French title was Technologie Sauvage, which I thought added a little je ne sais quoi to the title, but he has dumbed it down for us, which is, of course, probably required. It's both a professional and personal pleasure to have Daniel Andler with us today.
Thanks. Thank you, Dan. So, apparently I have a thing here. Turn it on. Can you hear me? Anyway, you could hear me even without the system, I suppose. So, hello again for some of you. I'm very happy to be here, and I'm very grateful to Professor Wagner for inviting me to this series. Maybe a word about the title. There's a famous book in cognitive science that you may or may not have heard of by Edwin Hutchins called Cognition in the Wild. It was published in, I think, 1995, so now it's almost ancient history. But it's a book that changed the intellectual landscape in cognitive science to a certain degree, because Ed Hutchins, who is actually an anthropologist and also a professor of anthropology and cognitive science at UCSD, and also, as you may know, a certified Boeing 747 pilot, thought that cognition was also not something that was to be studied only in laboratory conditions, memory, reasoning, problem solving, and that sort of thing. But it was also something that was deployed in real situations, and deployed in such a way that where our cognition was no longer just a matter of one person sort of perceiving, reasoning, inferring, and doing things, but that cognition was distributed among individuals and between individuals and artifacts and the whole system. And in fact, the system he studied is a air carrier of the US Navy. And the navigation system there he regarded as, he studied as a cognitive system in itself with various parts, the various people involved, and the cognitive ability of this air carrier to navigate correctly without crashing into a rock or into other boats is a property of the system and not just a property of individuals. So it's a vague reference. There's no direct connection between Ed Hutchins' approach and mine, but there's a family resemblance, let me say. Okay, so outline. First of all, what is a philosopher doing studying this sort of things? So this was a discussion we had yesterday in Dan Wagner's seminar. And of course, there's no general answer. I mean, there's no pre-assigned role for the philosopher. And different philosophers who are willing to get interested in this sort of topic are going to do it from different standpoints with different attitudes. Some will work side by side with education people and technologists. Others will try and take a more general overview. And I try to do a little bit of each. And of course, being spread thin, I probably don't do it very well one way or another. But I do try to work side by side with colleagues from other disciplines and non-academic people as well, and I think that's a very interesting part of the assignment. But I also sometimes try and play the sort of more traditional philosopher's role, which is to sort of see what exactly are the sources of knowledge and information that are involved, what may be lacking, what sort of concepts sort of undergo some sort of slippage when you move from one field to the other, and how does it then somehow all hang together? Now, in a way, it's pretentious to come out and say, you know, I'm going to tell you how things hang together. And a decent philosopher is a humble person. In that way, maybe that's the only way I'm a decent philosopher. I'm humble enough to realize that it's not a decisive contribution. It might not be that helpful, but it's something that I do attempt to do. And in this talk, I will be referring to some of my hands-on experience a little bit, but I will also be playing the other role, how it all hangs together. So bear with me, because sometimes it may sound a little abstract and maybe not that immediately useful, but you know, it's for you to say how you like it. Okay, so the outline is as follows. I will try and outline, define sort of a problem situation. What's the problem exactly that I'm going to try and address? Not solve, of course, but you know, throw some light on. I will then proceed to briefly tell you about two examples. One is an experiment that, it's not exactly an experiment, it's a report that my group made with the thought of maybe leading to some pilot exercise in Africa, and then another hands-on thing, which I haven't done, but which is really happening and is an example that I think one should meditate, a very simple example. So we'll quickly take a look at these two examples. Then I will start playing philosopher and say, well, you know, what do we need to understand? What's ill understood? How could we go about understanding it better? And finally, I will try and defend something which is, you know, maybe the word is fancy. I don't know if you're familiar with it, but it's an idea that you will recognize, and I think is maybe insufficiently stressed. At least I would like to stress it very much, how technology should go about on the colonizing mode rather than the other mode that I will be discussing later on. Okay, so first the problem situation. Well, great expectations, very familiar terrain for all of you, I'm sure. And certainly, you know, obviously Dan Wagner knows more about it. He's a real specialist of that. You know, obviously there are huge educational needs, and that goes for developed countries, privileged parts of developed countries, underprivileged parts of developed countries, and developing countries at all sorts of levels. Continuing education, lifelong education, et cetera, formal, informal, huge needs. Second, colossally change-inducing technologies, ICT, right? the two seem to fit like glove to hand. I mean, that's an argument that's developed, you know, in a serious way. I'm not being serious. I'm just giving a very broad picture. Read, you know, the works by Dan Wagner. I mean, he argues in a very persuasive manner that these two really fit like glove to hand. They're made, and there's a conceptual reason. I mean, they're made of the same fabric. I mean, education is about, in a way, it's a simple-minded way of saying it, transferring information or putting information in the right spot in people's minds in the right way, in the right format, and so on. Obviously, you could object to this way of describing education, but that's not my point today. Basically, education is about improving, say, people's information processing capabilities. And information technology is information technology. So it's really the same stuff, basically, right? So this is one sort of basic, simple reason why there's a very close fit. So everything is hunky-dory, and yet, oops, and yet, well, I thought I had a fourth line saying that, maybe a slide disappeared. I suppose I wanted to say what you all know, which is that despite the fact that there's this huge need and this tremendous resource, which is ICT, somehow things are not, you know, moving quite as fast as we would like it to be. It's not so clear that ICT is meeting the needs and so on. I suppose that's what I wanted to say. The next slide is about the fact that if you, an audience such as this is, there's a selection bias. I mean, the reason you came is that you probably believe that there's good stuff going on, it's very promising and so on. But as you know, in the real world, there are lots of people who don't feel that way, who are skeptical. And one of the things they will come up with is a sort of argument, sort of pessimistic induction argument, in which you say, well, you know, people have been saying there's constantly some great new invention that's going to somehow change things, going to be a sea change in education. Just wait and see, give us a little money and opportunity, and we're going to do it for you. So, you know, let me list just a few of the things, some of which did work and are still doing some work. You know, the radio, TV, something you probably don't know because it's prehistoric, but CAL was computer-aided learning or instruction. It was actually instruction, I think. And then there was ICAI, actually, intelligently computer-aided instruction. That was in the early heady days of artificial intelligence. Then there are simple things like slide projectors and overhead projectors and VCRs, and having computers in the school, first 1 and then 2 and 3. You certainly don't remember that area, but I do. And in the school first, you know, the one place, one computer somewhere in the school, that was going to change things, and then you would have one computer in the classroom, and then you have tons of computers in the classroom. You have educational software of all sorts that anxious parents have been buying. You have MP3s, you have laptops, and you even have one laptop per child, and you have beamers and PowerPoints like the one I'm using today, and you have interactive whiteboards, and you have cell phones and handhelds and smartphones and tablets, and you have now gaming, serious game approach, educational gaming, and so on. And all of this seems to be you know, the ever-vanishing silver bullet. And of course, people say, there's no silver bullet, you know, it's a part of, but it's going to induce a change nonetheless, so you oscillate between making promises and sort of being very cautious. So let's take a step back and sort of remind ourselves of what, beyond the sort of successive technologies and promises that were more or less fulfilled, what can ICT, and in particular M-learning, which is sort of the latest stage of this, can bring. And so here my animation went completely wrong. I went from one presentation to the other. So let me just put everything on the screen. Okay. Nope. Here we go. So it seems to me that ICT and M-learning can bring, and do bring to a certain extent, 3 sort of kinds of improvements or changes. One has to do with new forms of teaching and learning. That's really the educational side. That's the blue shape there. You have the pink or purple shape that concerns new ways of running the education process: communication, transmission, administration, payment of teachers, control, and all of that. Very, very hugely important. And the one sort of area which I think M-learning is particularly important for, and again, it's, you know, not new. I'm not saying anything that you don't actually know. I'm just sort of trying to put the emphasis where I think it should go. ICT in general and M-learning in particular change things on along the dimension of accessibility and range. It lifts time, space, and scope limitations. So why does M-learning more particularly seem so promising? Well, again, pretty obvious, because cell phones are mobile. They move with their owners or users. They're not all owners. Sometimes they're users without being owners, but whatever they are, they have their cell phones in their pockets, so it's with them all the time and on all the time. Cell phones are more and more like computers. And cell phones are communication devices allowing all sorts of interactions, collaboration between peers and between learners and educators, for example. And let me stop for a while, just for a very short time, to stress that cell phones combine two functions which are run together permanently in ICT for development, ICT for education, technology-enhanced learning, which is the computational element, the information processing element, and the communication element. There are two dimensions. Now, the two dimensions are intermingled in a very complex and interesting, intellectually interesting way, historically interesting way. It all comes from the idea, I mean, the common root is information, and the fact that everything is deep down zeros and ones, to put it very briefly. But they're still distinct functions, and it's useful to distinguish them. I mean, on the one hand, you have basically, say, the algorithms that are used by the mind or by the computer or in more complex ways, which lead to cognitive functioning and learning new algorithms or learning new ways of processing information makes you a better cognitive agent, right? And that's the learning process. So it has to do with essentially computation, expanding the computational capacities of the learners, of the students. Now, when I say computational, I want you to take it in an extremely broad sense. I don't want to, we may discuss it together, but in discussion period. But the point here is not to question the computational metaphor and all of that, or the computer metaphor. Let's just say that there are information processing capabilities that are changed through the educational or the learning process. So that's one thing. And the other thing is communication, and that's a different thing. And I think it's useful to distinguish those two, even though, for example, the cell phone, especially it becomes a smartphone, somehow again recombines in its own way the computational capacity or the computational dimension and the communicative dimension. Okay. Of course, another reason we tend to run those two together is that internet, at least web, I think that's the point of Web 2.0. I mean, the way I've understood that image or metaphor of Web 2.0 is that precisely internet, which was initially just a matter of transmitting information, so essentially a communicative function, turned out to be also a computational function, because suddenly the web is some sort of agent with which one interacts and with which one cooperates to yield new informational results, not just transmission of, say, Professor Wagner's home phone, for example. Okay, now, again, going back to cell phones after this little, little thing about distinguishing these two functions. As a result of sort of combining this communicative and this computational function or dimensions, cell phones are powerful barrier smashers and connection enhancers. They turn learning into a resource which is available at any time, anywhere, to anyone. Of course, that's a simplification, but it's a well-known slogan, and I think to a great extent it's an honest claim, at least in general form. It allows fluid crossovers between technologies. You can combine cell phones with all sorts of things, from radio to interactive whiteboards or even pen and pencils and so on. It allows cross-fertilization between technology and practices which are bound to the local context in a way which is, I think, completely novel. I mean, if you send out a printed book that's printed in London or Paris or even Addis Abeba, and you send it out to a village somewhere in Mali, the book is not going to interact in any serious way. I mean, it's going to be understood and read by the teacher and understood by the students, and the exercises will be done. But it has nothing to do with the local context. And of course, you cannot have as many printed books as you have local context. There are too many villages in India and Africa and even in France to have a customized book every time. By definition, a book, a textbook is context-free. It's context-insensitive. And in a way, it's an important thing. It's an important property it has. It should be context-insensitive in some ways. But the cell phone somehow makes that constraint disappear. Somehow cell phones can make the local context. Someone was talking about at lunchtime, I think, about, you know, or yesterday in the seminar, someone was saying, look, people want to learn about how to, what's the right time to plant the seeds and with how much water. Well, that's typically something, of course, there might be somewhere a specialized data bank or a specialized book on what to do with those particular seeds and how much to water them. But with a cell phone, you get that information available on the spot right when you need it. So that's an enormous change. And finally, that's funny, the number of bits that, maybe that's an old version of my slides or something. I don't know what it was supposed to be connecting, but it's connecting, obviously, stakeholders. It connects the local person to the central information booth somewhere out there, 200 miles away, and even to further off stakeholders. Okay, so that's the general idea, and this is the way it's supposed to work, and to some extent it does work. But do we have evidence that it works? There's clearly much promise and hope in the expanded use of ICTs and especially learning for education. But there's also well-known ignorance of the consequences or impact of ICTs on education goals and targets. A relevant and credible knowledge base is an essential part in helping policymakers make effective decisions in ICT4E, and that's a quote from a famous scholar here in the room, 2005. Now let's look a little bit at M-learning. So you might say, well, Dan Wagner was writing in 2005, this is 2012, things have improved enormously since then, and that's probably true. Now look at M-learning, which in a way was only beginning when Dan was writing that particular report, okay? So let's see what evidence we have about M-learning, as this is sort of the latest sort of silver bullet, right? So this is what we read from authors that you may know better what their situation in the field is. I don't know them. I've read an interesting and convincing sounding paper. You have the names of these, the authors write down, a paper published quite recently, 2010. It is questionable whether much has been learned about the use of M-learning as a way to enhance learning. There does not yet seem to be a strong and strategically established research agenda for investigating M-learning. Overall findings are inconclusive, lack the power to generalize to instruction and learning beyond the samples drawn. The questions about the viability of M-learning and whether M-learning will be of equal importance all over the world or only in particular regions or contexts where the needs are greatest have not yet been investigated directly. So apparently, people who know a lot, in fact, this is sort of a meta-study, these two scholars have studied reports on some pretty local, some on the contrary taking samples of a number of experiments, pilot experiments, and this is their conclusion. So it seems that we don't have that much evidence. Now, why would we want evidence? After all, there are lots of things that we do in life, and history has shown that, you know, you just try things, and maybe you're lucky, and maybe there's Darwinian selection, and maybe sort of things recombined on the fly, and that's how you get good systems. So, you know, you don't just first accumulate a huge amount of evidence and then start doing things. That often doesn't work either. So after all, we could say, you know, we don't really need evidence. But we must, of course, find out what works and what doesn't, and we must find out what makes what works work and what prevents what doesn't work from working. We must try and identify what works, possibly before it is done and not after. Why? Well, because failure is costly in terms of time, money, the confidence of the stakeholders, the well-being and authority of the teachers. Say a teacher sort of proposes a technique, says, we're going to do this, everything's going to change because now we have these interactive whiteboards or God knows what. And then somehow it doesn't really work. Well, the teacher is losing part of her confidence, her self-confidence, and part of the confidence and trust of the students. Students' education and trust in education is also impaired because they were led to think that they were going to learn something more efficiently than, say, their parents or elder brothers and sisters, and it turns out not to work that much. So it's not such a good idea to fail. Although it's a good idea to risk, to try, and to make attempts, it's not such a good idea to fail. It's true that we don't have clear and reasonably complete, uncontroversial answers to the first class of questions about what works and what doesn't work. But I think that we should also look for some clues regarding the second class. And I will get back to this. And let me, before I do that, introduce an important parallel. And I don't know how familiar it is to you or maybe to the certain specialized sector of the field, but to us at Compas, we were very struck by the fact that medicine, in a way, is a little bit ahead of education in terms of tackling a certain type of problem, such as the one that I'm raising today for education. So medicine faces a similar problem in deciding which kinds of theoretical results are going to be clinically tested. It's an important issue because a test costs a lot. It's time-consuming, it's important to patients, it costs in terms of money, financial stakes, and one must be really careful in choosing the kind of result that is susceptible to be beneficial, to a large enough class of patients. So all of this has to be done a little bit ahead of time, because you can't sort of launch experiments in public health and medicine without having some idea of, you know, the general reasons you might have to believe that it's going to work or not going to work. So this is not so different from identifying a new technology that works and solves real problems in the educational domain for a large enough, interesting enough, relevant enough part of the world population. So let me now, after these sort of general considerations, move on fairly quickly to the two experiments I want to talk about. And one, again, is not exactly an experiment. It's an experiment to be. And the other is an ongoing experiment. So the first experiment is this EFTPAF, which stands for, in French, so you'll know that I speak French, I can speak French, enseignement du français par téléphone portable pour l'Afrique francophone, using cell phones to teach French in sub-Saharan Francophone Africa. Now, what happened is that the Compas group, this think tank that Dan Wagner was talking about in introducing me, was asked by a powerful, important publisher of textbooks, which I'm not at liberty of naming. I hope it doesn't appear here. Does it appear? No, it doesn't appear, which is good. It's an industrial secret. Anyway, that publisher, following in the footsteps of publishers in the English language, which that tend to be more advanced than this French publisher. French publishing is not at the vanguard, let's say. But still, there was someone intelligent enough in working in that publishing house to realize that, sending out textbooks by the tens of thousands of tons, even if paid by the World Bank, in the remotest villages of Africa, it was just no longer viable. It's just not a viable way, and they should go for new methods. So they asked us to simply do a pilot study of the feasibility. How many cell phones, what kinds of cell phones, what sort of bandwidth, and that sort of thing. And then what sort of contents, what sorts of things can be taught in what ways using these cell phones, mobile technologies in general, cell phones in combination with other means. So this is what we did, and we divided this study in two parts. One part started from the technology. So we discovered things, but at least we have proof that cell phones are for real, in case you had any doubt. They're for real even in Africa. And we looked at the concepts and practices of M-learning as they were under development when we did the study, which was back in 2009, so it's already a little bit late. We're a little bit behind. And we studied quite closely a variety of applications, going from safe to disruptive applications, following the conceptual distinction drawn by Steed and very well-quoted and often quoted paper in 2006. So basically safe means that you integrate the mobile phones or the cell phones or whatever technology, in fact, in an educational system, a process, a method, without disrupting it. It's sort of complementing it, facilitating it, blending smoothly and enriching it. And disruptive means that it's changing things rather radically. That is, if you choose to go that way, if you choose to use cell phones, then you're disrupting the normal educational process. So we looked at the various things. We were, of course, more excited about disruptive technologies or disruptive uses of technology than safe uses, but there's a place also for safe uses. And we looked a little bit at the overall disruptive effect of M-learning in education and discovered that M-learning in many ways encourages a rediscovery of a number of old themes in the practice and philosophy of education, back to Dewey, empowerment, and all sorts of things that I don't want to dwell on here, but which are, I'm sure, familiar to you. And we looked and we saw that cell phones are already bringing changes in the social, economic landscape in developing countries. looking at various experiments, some of which you've heard about in this series, I saw, or you will be hearing about, or have read about, or have yourselves participated in. And these are some of the conclusions of this first part of our report. In developed countries with what I call dense formal systems of education, basically schools and so on, M-learning has the clearest benefits in high-tech hybrid setups, linking and enhancing well-established pedagogical practice. It is in most cases, at best, moderately transformative, but may have side benefits along the social psychological dimension. What I mean by that, what we meant by that, is that in terms of strict pedagogic, content-centered dimension, it enhances, it doesn't change things very much. On the other hand, typically, and you probably know about that, it can change the atmosphere. It can change the atmosphere between in the class, in the school, remobilize, rehabilitate people or students who feel disenfranchised from the school system and so on. So this is what I mean by social psychological dimension. In developing countries, by contrast, especially the least developed areas, M-learning relies on low-tech and mostly communicative functions of cell phones. Remember my distinction between computational and communicative dimensions. Making possible or increasing, enlarging the possibilities tremendously in areas such as tutoring, peer support, and a direct response to perceived needs, educational, both narrow and broad, that is, as I was saying, health, hygiene, early warning in case of disasters or dangers, et cetera, et cetera. So these are areas, but it's essentially the good old communicative function of the phone, except that it's a cell phone, it's in everybody's pocket. And that's potentially transformative. Our third conclusion, or third main conclusion, there were others, is that it's futile to miniaturize existing educational materials, contents, and methods so as to fit them in cell phones. In other words, one simple idea of the publisher was just take a textbook, for example, a literacy textbook, or just a French textbook meant to teach French to people who don't know French, who don't know very good French. Just sort of put it in such formats, little teeny bits, cut it up in little pieces, and feed those pieces in the cell phone. Well, we thought we could conclude that that was not a good idea, and instead we should start from the technology and see what contribution it can make to the learning process. So part two, on the contrary, started from, so this is the cover of the part two of our report, starting from the educational situation. So part one, remember, we started from the technological situation, cell phones in Africa, how many are they, et cetera. This time we start from the educational situation. Here we follow, we have just one master, Dan Wagner. This is just pure Wagner as far as we've understood. This is an area in which, he's a specialist and we certainly weren't. And we follow in his footsteps. So, first element of the problem is that the educational field in developing countries, and especially in sub-Saharan Africa, Francophone Africa, is densely packed with institutions, traditions, practices, whether in formal or informal settings. It's not a tabula rasa in terms, it's just as densely packed and maybe more densely packed than the situation that the educationalist meets in developed countries. On the other hand, many people have no stable access to education, even when they do receive some training. And even when they do receive some training, it quickly evaporates. So you do what you should do and teach French in a perfectly decent, intelligent way to a bunch of people, and then they disappear because they got to go back to the fields, and after 6 months, what you've taught them has essentially evaporated. And the second sort of part of the problem situation is that the mastery of the language is key. I think there was some discussion of that yesterday in the seminar. And the demand for the dominant or official language, in this case French, in other cases, of course, English, this demand is enormous. And some of our conclusions are as follows. First of all, and I think that blends in well, I think, with what Dan Wagner thinks, narrow and broad notions of literacy should be simultaneously pursued, although they lead to focusing on in a slightly different foci. Narrow literacy is just the efficient transmission of and training in traditional material importable from standard methods and vectors. Now, narrow literacy is just writing and reading in French or in English or whatever it may be. And broad literacy includes what may be called 21st century skills, although there might be sort of local variations about 21st century skills, maybe not quite the same for an MIT student, going into business or banking or insurance. That's one sort, and maybe for an African agriculturalist, it's something slightly different, but still basically skills that have to do with communication, cooperation, and autonomous learning from self-generated material gathered on the fly on the internet and so on and so forth. So both should be pursued. Sometimes you want to focus on just teaching the language, period, because that's what people really want. They want to master French for all sorts of reasons, good reasons. And other times you also want to stress the fact that they need not only to learn French, but also how to use a cell phone efficiently and internet efficiently and so on and so forth. Second conclusion is, what language should we teach? So the initial demand was for French, but then, and then again, I think that's a lesson from Dan Wagner, the maternal language, the mother tongue, the local tongue is a crucial component, both as an end, it empowers people, especially women, and then it's a means, because how do you transmit the knowledge of French if not through the maternal language? Now, there are other methods, immersion and so on, but in practice, it's much better to be able to rely on literacy in the local language. And miraculously, as I wrote, M-learning can do both for essentially the same price. So here's a real miracle. I mean, that is not feasible by the traditional print book methods or other traditional methods, but it is possible with cell phones or similar technologies. Third conclusion is M-learning should be modularized and blended into various other formats, both in school and out of school, formal methods, radio, etc. So don't think of the cell phone as the sole source or sole media. It blends in with others. It's combined in many different intelligent, smart ways, self-organized ways sometimes. And finally, M-learning should be conceived from the start as customizable for teachers, to children and adults, whether supervised or fully autonomous. Don't sort of pre-decide that it's going to be, just for primary school teachers or just for primary school teachers in such and such a setting. From the start, think of your technology as adaptable to a wide variety along many dimensions of public, transmitters, enhancers, tutors, and so on. So this is essentially, this was the dialectical situation. I'm running behind, I have to hurry. This is the dialectical situation that we were faced with in part one. The ones to be enlightened are the non-technologists, typically the traditional French publisher we were trying to convince to push this experiment. By the way, nothing has happened since. So we were not particularly successful at convincing that publisher of going ahead. They needed very much to be persuaded of the added value of ICT. And in part two, it's the reverse. I mean, we're talking to technologists, people who have no doubt that ICT can be useful. They can't wait to just sort of, do the stuff, sell it to you, and so on. And they need to be persuaded that ICT isn't itself a solution, that content and context are crucial, to sum it up very briefly. Okay, so let me very quickly tell you about another experiment which I found out about quite recently at a conference. I discovered, I was not the first to discover, because this young man has already received awards and so on. Maybe Dan has heard about him already. So the experiment is called JIVER. I don't know why it's called JIVER, and it's very simple. It's using Twitter to teach reading and writing in first grade in an industrial suburb of Dunkirk, in a formal school, regular primary school, first year of primary school, first grade. So this is the young man, Jean-Roch Masson. He's tremendous. He's really a fantastic guy. And this is his Twitter page. And the idea is very, very simple. I mean, he realized that 6-year-old kids learn reading and read. 6-year-old kids deal with short sentences, and Twitter deals with short sentences. And what a great idea! And to learn to read and write is, especially in the first half of the first grade, is something they're not particularly curious to do. They don't see why. I mean, daddy or mommy will read the books they want to read, so why would they have to learn how to write and read? It's difficult. You should see how difficult it is if you've forgotten. It's a real effort. But children love to communicate. They just love to express themselves, and Twitter allows them to express themselves if only they will push the right keys and produce something vaguely resembling or roughly resembling to what they want to communicate. Well, it's worked absolute wonders. I don't want to spend too much time because I'm already short in time, but let me tell you that it's working wonders. This is a wonderful experiment, and you can follow it, and you can follow. I'm no Twitter person. I don't really know how it works, although I've just opened an account in order to be part of that experiment. But you can look it up, and you'll see it's very interesting. There's also a blog that this young man is maintaining, in which there are really fascinating exchanges. So through this really, really elementary idea, I mean, it's not. It's so simple, right? All sorts of really interesting and deep issues which are transferable to all sorts of other contexts and other countries, other social classes and so on. Other institutional contexts are raised and discussed on this blog. So now we come to understanding, and we have maybe 10 minutes at most to understand. So I will, I tend to be, that's a poor timer of talks, and this is an experiment. I mean, some people do the same talk 20 times. I never do the same talk twice. So, but one result is that it's always a new experiment, and I always realize it's a little too long. So let me start with a few distinctions. Some are pretty obvious: innovations which work and don't work, and innovations which are simple and which are complex. So I only put one uncontroversial thing in this four cells logical space. OLPC seems, I don't know, I like OLPC. I don't think it's a bad idea, but still it doesn't seem to work, and it's extremely complex. And you can fill out those, the other three as you like. A simple thing that seems to work is IVER, right, what I just mentioned. And then there are more complex things that are working that you've heard about or hear about in this series. And there's also simple things that don't work. Now, there's another distinction which I don't think quite lines up with this one, which are innovations which are and are not transformative. No, non-transformative innovations we like to call in my group electrified versions. I mean, we like to talk about electrification. You take the function of washing clothes, and then you invent the washing machine. You've electrified this function. It's great. It's fantastic. I mean, I don't want to go back to a world in which there were no washing machines. So I'm not saying it's a bad idea, but it's a pity. It's not transformative. Essentially, it's transformative for women's lives in many ways. But the basic idea that dirty laundry gets thrown into water and soap and agitated and comes out clean and is then dry, that's pretty unchanged. It's just been electrified, right? Now, there are other ways, there are other sorts of innovations, which are transformative innovations, which are novel ways of cutting the cake. Imagine a washing machine that would maybe also cook dinner, for example, or do half of the washing and half of the cooking, and the other half of the washing and the other half of the cooking would be done by, I don't know, the coffee machine or something like that. That's transformative. And this is what technology can sometimes do. It really changes the meaning, the context of some of our individual and collective behaviors. So examples of non-transformative technologies, interactive whiteboards, I think, are essentially non-transformative. You might want to challenge that. What we call ENTs, and I don't even, apparently I asked yesterday at the seminar, whether you had an expression for that in English, and I didn't get a clear response. ENT in French, because you want to know that I'm French again, is environnement numérique de travail. And so it's a digital workspace. And essentially, it's what you guys have, of course, here at Penn and probably in your high school as well, and many schools in the States and many other institutions in the States, which is essentially there's, for Mary Frank, there's an account number somewhere on the computer, and there she has all the material and her notes, grades, and the deadlines at which she has to file certain things and change courses and all this. And she has her special resources on internet and intranet and communicating with people and so on, and the teachers and so on. And this is all integrated, an integrated thing. And of course, it makes things very convenient. Often it's non-transformative, I would say. Now, some forms of M-learning are, in fact, transformative, I think. Now, more difficult questions. Does the transformative, non-transformative distinction line up with progressive and non-progressive, or really great and not so great? Is transformative an intrinsic property of a technology, or is it context-dependent? Is there a sharp dividing line between innovative or transformative and non-transformative? Can innovations be regressive? I think all of these are very interesting questions, and there's no time to answer. I just want to raise them. Let me now reorganize the rest of my talk. Maybe I'll just throw this in, and we'll then rush to pretty close to my conclusion. Again, this is sort of the thing that a philosopher likes to do, and a non-philosopher thinks is maybe not that useful. I don't know. You'll tell me. What makes innovation in education so special? I mean, why is it so difficult and sometimes disappointing, exciting and disappointing and so on? Well, I would say, so this is my suggestion, that education is at the intersection of three realms, three large areas, which I call the artificial, the natural, and the human. These might be misleading labels. I can't think of perfectly convincing labels, so let me very quickly tell you what I mean by these three realms. The easiest to explain is the natural realm. The natural realm is essentially the basic cognitive processes that underlie the learning, teaching, educational process. What goes on in people's minds with the students at various stages, the initial stage, the student's endowment when he or she is born, basically, how it develops through infancy, et cetera, and what happens in your mind and my mind when I learn and when I teach. Okay, so that's the natural. That's pretty simple. The human is also pretty simple. Of course, human means many things, but by human here, I mean the anthropological, sociological, institutional, cultural dimension. Learning occurs in a setting, which is typically Penn, for example. That's a complicated human, social, political, cultural, ethical, spiritual, etc. Man-made, essentially man-made, this is why I call it human, Our neurons are not man-made, but this pen is man-made, pen and everything that goes with it, right? Now the artificial. The artificial, that's the most misleading. This is why I kept it as a label. This is why I kept it for the end. What I mean by artificial in this context is the productions of the human mind, which are concepts, theories, the way we represent the world. For example, the way we represent and talk about the educational process, the curriculum, methods that teachers are supposed to learn to make them efficient teachers, our conceptions of how cognition works, how learning works, etc. And what the artifacts, the things, the objects, complex objects sometimes like cell phones and computers that we make. How do we make them? We make them because we apply our concepts of reality and say, well, we're going to put things together in such a way that, for example, a phone will allow us to communicate with our mothers on her birthday, right? Because we have a concept of birthday, we have a concept of mother, we have a concept of communication. We, with the help of Benjamin Franklin and others, we've managed to understand how a phone might be built up, and we do this, and this is man-made, okay? Education is at the intersection of these three realms. That makes it enormously complicated and enormously difficult to influence in the right way. It's not a simple situation in which you can just throw in a little bit more money, a little bit more intelligence, a new concept or whatnot, because all of this is going to interact, the concept, new concept, going to interact with the cognitive processes that you have no control of, the way your mind is set up, and with the institutional process. You don't change pen just by introducing a new concept, right? Or your idea of what a proper education is, or what it is to be brave and lead a good life, okay? So we have two connection issues. One is the human-artificial connection, which is basically, in this case, typically a problem is you introduce a new technology that follows a certain conceptual grid, a certain representation of what's happening and what you can make with that, and then it's thrown in an institutional, cultural, anthropological context. How are these going to mesh? So typically, I mean, these are fancy ways of saying things that are quite familiar. Typically, a technological innovation is going to meet with success, and non-success is going to be accepted, and not accepted is going to be co-opted for other uses according to the human context, right? And the second connection is the artificial and the natural. So in this case, typically, you introduce either a new concept of education, say, I don't know, learning by doing. Take learning by doing. Okay, we discussed this yesterday in the seminar. So that's a concept. People have thought hard about what learning is, what doing is. They think maybe you can learn by doing. Okay, well, how is that going to be, how is this concept going to meet with the constraints imposed by our neurons, essentially, by our natural setup and by the plasticity? There is plasticity, but that plasticity is not infinite. You know, not any bright idea is going to somehow mesh with, be compatible with our cognitive setup, right? So I had more to say in quotes. A nice quote from Thorndike, 1910, The Contribution of Psychology to Education. I'm sure that Dan knows this text very well. And we're in the triple bind, which is that we don't know. Oh, I have to stop. Okay, so let me move just to my conclusion, okay? Whoop, whoop, whoop. So I had stuff with, you know, the comparison with medicine, stuff with on colonization. I will just sum up what I said and also sum up parts of what I didn't have time to say, my fault entirely. So first of all, ICT 4D requires ingenuity, perseverance, enthusiasm, creativity, political skills, and all of that. I didn't say that, but that's obvious. And of course, it requires knowledge, and this is obvious, although I did try to say a little bit more, make more explicit why we need knowledge, what kinds of knowledge that what kinds of knowledge would be needed. Third, we don't have in usable form, this is a part that I did not develop sufficiently due to lack of time, in usable form nearly all the knowledge we need. So, and again, this is something that I will just explain on the fly, taking just 2 more minutes. One of the strategy is to actively seek the knowledge. So we need knowledge from, for example, cognitive science, which is the area that I'm most familiar with. We need knowledge, we don't have it. Or what knowledge we have is not in usable form. It's seldom in usable form. So we should seek that knowledge. We need it, we don't have it, we should seek it. And we should follow the lead of medicine. Basically, in order to treat patients, whether individual patients or classes of patients in a certain institution, for example, a public hospital in an American city, using various drugs and so on, and various techniques and therapy, we need knowledge that comes from biology, basic biology, but is not in usable form. Some of the knowledge is available, but we don't know how to formulate it in such a way that we can use it. Some of the knowledge isn't available. There are lots of things that we don't know, that we would need to know. But basic biologists don't even know that we need that knowledge. They have other things to do. Their attention is elsewhere. So we need translational research which expresses, puts from the bedside, as they say, the questions that need to be asked, and which the basic biologist has to respond to. And on the other hand, what the biologist knows has to be put in such a form that it can be used for by the bedside of the patient. And it's exactly the same in education. The equivalent of the bedside is the bench, it's the classroom, or other settings, educational settings, some of them informal, out of school and so on. And on the side of biology, you have, say, to be brief, cognitive science, and you need translational research that goes both ways in order to gradually acquire the knowledge you need on the side of the bench of the school. And a second strategy, is to use knowledge that's built in existing arrangements and colonize them, co-opt them. So in other words, when you don't have the explicit knowledge that you need, the explicit knowledge is somehow implicitly built in setups that work. So take setups that work and were meant maybe for another purpose and co-opt them for educational purposes. And this is a technique that's already proved to work. There are quite a number of examples. Maybe they're pilot examples. Maybe we don't know exactly why they work, but they do work. So colonization is a good idea. You should pursue both ends in parallel, and in order to pursue all of this and to balance all the other constraints that I talked about very, very briefly, one more thing is required, which is practical wisdom at the individual and the collective level. So this introduces a political, ethical dimension in the debate, which I think should not be neglected. Now, my final two comments, and I'm done. First of all, we at Compas, we believe that practical wisdom is actually a skill, an expert skill that can be taught. So that's an idea that we have that's essentially our own. That's original. I didn't have time to develop it. That was not my main topic. But we need practical wisdom to make real progress in many fields, also business ethics and God knows what, but also in ICT for development. And it turns out that practical wisdom is something that can be taught, and with the help of ICT, which is sort of a nice sort of folding on itself of the problematic. And finally, collective wisdom is a wide open and painful question, especially in this electoral days, for political scientists and to some degree social epistemologists. And that's essentially the end. But before I finish, I want to thank very much my collaborator, Elena Pasquinelli, who is the soul of the Compas group and with whom I have developed the ideas that I presented to you today. Thank you.
So the floor is open, and I'm going to start. This is, I would say one of the pleasures of having somebody come in from your perspective, Daniel, is that it is so different from the typical kind of presentation we had on ICT4D.
Right.
So to that extent, it's difficult to appreciate, but it's also what do you call it? It's disruptive.
Right.
In the best sense of what you were talking about, disruptive. And I guess I'm sorry that I had to sort of call on you in terms of time, just at the point that I was most interested in,
yes.
which was item number 3, which was on colonizing, which I think I got it from your conclusion, but I couldn't help but think to myself in the same mode as I was saying before. Nice to have somebody in from, let's say, a francophone perspective, because it would be hard to have an American up there supporting the idea of colonizing.
Colonizing, yes.
But being French, you kind of get away with it.
Especially in the African context, maybe it's not the best word, yes. Right.
I don't know, but I guess there are many different issues. I appreciate you, and I also had the pleasure, some of you know my work, of hearing your version of my work. It was also fascinating and new. It was also disruptive in its own way. So I guess my first question is about this issue of colonizing. I mean, can you give us an example in the context of ICT4D of what you mean by colonizing?
Okay. Thanks for the question, and thanks for the positive appreciation of the disruption. No, I realized I looked at the previous speakers and I saw that I was going to be scandalous. Let's see, what is it called? Our favorite example, or at least my favorite example, but I think it's also Elena, is something that's now well known, but in 2009 it was not at all known. We mentioned it left and right, no one had heard of it. It's called banking by cell phone, right? Yeah. So it's well known, right?
Yeah.
Now it's become well known. Even in France, they're paid, small, short reports in the weeklies and so on. So that's a typical case of colonizing. I mean, here you have cell phones and you have the idea of units. You have to pay number of units. You buy 100 units. It turns out to be money. I mean, that's amazing, creation of money. It was not at all meant that way. But suddenly someone thought, look, someone put, $10 somewhere. And that $10 becomes money that's transferable anywhere. It becomes this universal medium, and it was not at all meant for that. It was meant to pay for your telephone calls, and now it becomes access to banking, to money, to banking, to credit, all of that. So that's an example of colonization.
So the colonizer, who is the subject of the sentence? Is it the cell phone is colonizing a banking feature that was done through cash previously?
No, the cell phone is colonized. So the So my favorite image is a block of cement that's dropped at the bottom of the sea for unknown reasons, which have nothing to do with ecology or anything. And after 50 years, lo and behold, this block of cement has become home to countless creatures and plants which have colonized this block of concrete. So what is being colonized is a technology that was initially thought for other purposes, for X purposes, and it's being colonized, which I think co-opted, maybe co-opted would be better. It's co-opted for banking economic reasons. Another example from the French experience is Minitel, and of course you know about that story. Minitel was in those days, which were back maybe 40 years back, the French postal system, which was also the post and telephone system. It was one in PTT. And they realized that they were spending huge amounts of money printing telephone books. Every year, the telephone book was printed. It's the same in the States in those days. And they said, now, look, there's something, you know, they invented the internet, actually. It was called Minitel. It was a very primitive form of internet with the sole purpose, everyone had a little, how's it called?
Screen.
Yeah, everyone had a little screen.
Like a tablet.
Yeah. What the general word is you know, when the computer's somewhere out there and a terminal. That's right. Everyone had a terminal, a very primitive terminal. I still have one in my cellar as well. And that terminal was, and so already they had the idea that it was maybe not only for telephone numbers, telephone directory, but maybe other information like, you know, schedules of trains and stuff like that, but those schedules of trains would be provided by other providers. So something like the internet was, but what did people, it was used in Strasbourg. One of you mentioned Strasbourg just earlier because her sister is taking a physics thesis in Strasbourg. It was, the pilot study was done in Strasbourg. And what did they do with it? They started chatting and picking one another up. It became the Minitel Rose. So there were prostitutes, but also non-prostitutes, sort of offering services or trying to meet up with people. And suddenly, yeah. And suddenly, and the Minitel Rose, which initially was, you know, something you would not talk about because it was a little dirty, but actually it's become a prime example of a colonizing thing. I mean, this is supposed to give you telephone numbers. It's a telephone directory, essentially. And you're changing that telephone directory in a METIC type system 50 years before METIC or 40 years before METIC.
Okay, so, and therefore, if you were to, looking at the title of this talk, you would be arguing that those of us who are interested in education and educational purposes should be thinking of co-opting technology tools that are out there.
That's right.
Adapting them like your block of cement in the ocean, but somehow thinking about how to colonize them for purposes.
Right.
And so that fits with your example on the publisher.
That's right.
Except that one, the screen was too small.
Right.
On the mobile phones to deliver textbooks.
That's right. Right.
So what would have been great, and is still waiting to happen, and I might add something that would be great if you could get those guys to think about it, which is, you know, how could you take mobile phones that currently exist and see if you could create small little very cheap dumb terminals that could, instead of buying a whole tablet Apple, which costs hundreds of dollars, just to have a very simple black and white display of the mobile phone contents that are sent over the wireless connection and display a page of text. This is still something that nobody's developed. It would be perfect for a textbook publisher. But probably, if I can just add, I mean, like so many good ideas, we get overtaken by events.
Yes.
So that the next, you know, iPad version, somebody's going to come out with. In fact, we had a speaker a couple weeks ago, last week, Tim Unwin, who was showing around his latest cheapo tablet, and he was saying that next time he comes, he's going to have one that he'll roll up and put in his pocket. It's you know, a little bigger than this, but it will be like the size of a nice paperback.
Yeah, right. I heard about
which is a sort of what I'm suggesting here too, but the problem is how do you, it's one thing to have thought experiments about this.
Right.
It's another thing to actually be able to co-opt tools. It's nice, you know, you have cement blocks that you can co-opt and drop into oceans. I understand that.
Right.
But this roll-up thing in your pocket may not be co-optable because nobody may build it for you.
That's right. No,
they have a
exactly.
different market mechanism.
Exactly. And we're not going to wait until this great new little gadget is going to be invented. I mean, we in parallel, meanwhile, we do other things. Some of them are so simple. You just call someone up. You have a cell phone. Why don't you call someone who has access to the internet? This is a service that exists in several places in Africa and India. So internet is not everywhere for a bunch of reasons. So of course it will get there eventually, the cable, the bandwidth, and so on. But meanwhile, you can just call someone and the person looks things up on the internet, and suddenly you have something like a cell phone that's turned into a smartphone in the heart of Africa. That's co-opting again. That's combining. Well, that's a certain form of co-opting in which you just combine, you go hybrid. And of course, it's a self-organized thing. It's something that people think of on the spot. You can suggest them from from the MIT AI lab, but people are smart on, on the premises.
Right. When you do this, and I know others may want to ask a question, but I mean, one thing that's always, I think, what should I say, endemic or inherent in these kinds of conversations, and of course you heard a bit in my seminar yesterday, is we do all kinds of thought experiments. So we imagine what this new tablet would look like. We imagine somebody calling calling a free green line number somewhere and getting this, all these ideas that we have. For one thing, as you say, we often don't have any empirical evidence that they work. And even if by the time we gather that empirical evidence, that technology may be very interesting. So I wonder, what do you do with these ideas? Who do you talk to? How do you, you came up with the various conclusions, and I think pretty persuasive conclusions. But I don't know, if I were the skeptical kind of person, I would say, well, where do you draw those from? Can I bet on them? What should I be doing about them?
Right.
You probably get those kinds of questions, or do you?
Well, not very often, because somehow very few people are sufficiently, everyone's sort of going about their business and sort of pushing ahead. But let me go back on the first part of your question or challenge. I mean, for example, this idea of calling a green line, it works. I mean, in certain that's a system that exists. It's not something that I cooked up and said, look, why don't you guys do that? They are much smarter than me and know what their needs are, and they've done it. And then you said, now, by the time we've collected the evidence that it works, it's transformative, or at least it's efficient in a certain sense, things will have changed. There's also this wonderful Mixit, tutoring using Mixit, which is a very interesting topic, because not only is it suddenly making one-to-one tutoring possible at a very, very low cost, because students from the South African universities get credit for tutoring kids out there in the wild, sending in their questions about mathematics. So everyone finds an interest in that, a social interest, but also students get credit, and students get one-to-one tutoring. But as a side effect, it turned out, and that was something completely expected, that the format of mathematics, you'd think that, I mean, here you have text, how do you call them? Text messages. Text messages, I mean, that's a primitive way of communication. How are you going to do mathematic problems? And a student is lost in his triangles and circles and whatnot. Works very well. It's very simple. You can easily put these questions, these mathematical questions, in text messaging form. Works perfectly. That was unexpected. That's a side thing. So these are the sort of things that work. But now about the evidence, you're absolutely right. This is why I think that one should, and it'll lead me to your last question, we should look for evidence at a more general level. And of course, because it's more general, it takes longer to find, but then it's going to be more stable, and it's going to eventually lead labs and teams in the field and so on to sort of generate experiments more systematically and recover from failure more quickly. That's how it's always been in technology. Initially, the evidence is very sparse, so you start one thing. Planes, for example, you start, planes. First planes, complete failure, and so on. And then, at some point, a sufficient amount of evidence about what works and doesn't work, turbulence and whatnot, was amassed, and then people just started repeating the experiments quickly, more and more quickly, and suddenly planes took off very quickly. So this is the sort of thing that, I'm encouraging. But and now that's your last question. I have no idea who's interested in this sort of consideration. I mean, you're kind enough to listen to me today, and sometimes I can discuss things, with other audiences, but basically it's true that for the moment, there's no clear engagement. I think that in academia, I could have, and you, I'm sure, have a scholarly interchange with people who are doing this sort of analysis, the few quotes I gave, and though we have sort of a common ground, but then the other stakeholders, how maybe the people at maybe the people at World Bank are about to spend $30 billion.
It's partly an Anglophone, Francophone divide also, because the field is pretty vibrant in English.
Right. No, I'm sure.
And it sounds like, and we've talked about this before,
yeah.
But maybe it also relates to the other topic we were talking about earlier today, which is just the dearth or lack of educational research in the Francophone world is far less. The interest in educational research
it's true.
Is less. But let's see, were there others? Yeah.
I have a question. Thank you. It was very thought-provoking and interesting to hear your ideas on this. When you were talking a little bit about the project or the initiatives that you were working on in West Africa and your kind of context analysis of the educational situation, you talked about how even those who may have access to schools, sometimes the learning evaporates or is lost upon the learners. And I think that struck me because I thought, well, things evaporate in my mind also.
Yeah.
I have access to wonderful educational resources, lots of media and technology. So why is ICT in that kind of context? What sort of argument would you provide for why ICT may be the solution that people can absorb information or educational resources in a more appropriate way so that they're able to develop cognitively?
Okay, nice. Thanks very much for your question, which I will answer. I will give two sorts of answer. One sort of direct, and the other sort of more general and maybe vague. The direct answer is very simple. I mean, in this particular case, what we're thinking of is that just with a simple system of cell phone or text messaging reminders, we can just keep people informed. I mean, send them quizzes, for example. Resend them, have a system of reminders, like, in the formal session, you learned about verbs or imperatives or plurals or whatnot. Of course, 6 months later, you've forgotten, essentially. I've been trying to learn Italian. I have an Italian wife, and I've been trying to learn Italian for about 10 years with extremely limited success because I forget all the time. I repeat to be, I am, you are, he is, and so on.
Your problem is that your French is very good.
Right. Her French is very good. That's the problem. Yes, exactly. If I were sufficiently motivated that I had for example, she didn't speak French or it was, something absolutely essential, then I'd be very motivated to learn Italian. And I think it would help even me. I mean, it's true, I could do it on the internet, but if I just got an SMS, a text message, every evening saying, now, repeat or, do this or do that, or what's the question, I would, immediately try and respond, and I would get a response back saying, no, that's wrong. And I would get points. I mean, very simple things in that way. So it's not sophisticated. It's true. I mean, you're absolutely right. We always forget a lot of things, and we get confused, and you're absolutely right. But for simple language skills, I think it can, and I would argue the same for possibly simple mathematics, for example. It will work. So that's my immediate response, very simple. I don't know how good it is. Again, we would need evidence. I completely agree. But more generally, I would say this is typically the sort of thing, and this is where I'm a little bit less sanguine than you are, Dan. I do read the literature. I use Google Scholar, and although it's extremely vital, it's extremely repetitive and sometimes not that interesting. So it's true there's a lot of educational research, much more than in France. I mean, no comparison. And very interesting stuff in its own logic, but sometimes lack of significance, lack of robustness, lack of a general framework in which you could really base things. So I agree. Obviously, we need the space, but we need more. We need more. And so to respond to you, typically, I mean, this idea of evaporation. I'm sure there's quite a lot of basic research done on evaporation, probably not under that name. But here, I mean, most of us, I call it no. It's a philosopher's term.
What do you call it in French? Or Italian?
I don't know. What would you call it? Well, you could say, I mean, everyone would understand if in French, if I said évaporer, évaporation, oubli, I suppose, to forget, or, and in fact, I'm working on another project in which, and there's a technical term.
We use sometimes, in a positive sense, retention.
Retention.
Or failure to.
That's right.
Retention, failure.
That's right, retention. Yeah, that's one term, exactly. For example, in professional training using games or stuff like that, one sort of classical measure is the retention rate after 6 months. So for example, safety guidelines on in an airport, for example, you shouldn't back into a bus or something. Try not to do it too often. So they they teach them by various methods, some of which are serious games. And then the measure of the efficiency is to say, how many of these guidelines are actually applied 6 months after the training session.
But if I could follow on that, wouldn't it be more disruptive, to use your term?
Mm-hmm.
Wouldn't it be more disruptive to say you don't have to remember? In fact, you don't even have to know how to speak Italian, except with your wife.
Right.
Because you could look it up. Use Google Translate. Just speak into it in French or English and hold it up to your wife and say, here's what I think.
Right.
It comes out in Italian,
right.
Sort of.
Right.
But even in terms of the guidebooks you're talking about, or the text for kids learning stuff in school,
mm-hmm.
I mean, one of the other claims, the disruptive claims of technology, is that you don't have to know anything. All that rote learning that
right.
was very
right.
essential
right.
for especially French pedagogy,
mm-hmm.
that have known for that, and even more so in Africa. One of the disruptive features of technology is maybe you don't have to memorize as much.
Right, right.
You just
right.
point and click and it's there.
Yeah. Well, for
that
certain.
would be shocking, right?
Yeah, yeah. No, absolutely. So to go in that direction, the third person that I mentioned, Elena Pasquinelli, but there's also Roberto Casati, who's extremely smart, inventive person. And one of the disruptive things, he says, why teach kids to write? I mean, handwriting is extremely difficult to master. I mean, the amount of time that's wasted and the energy and the tears and all of that and the screams and so on. Why don't we forego this entirely? And now we have these little things. They push letters, and that works very well. And so, of course, they're losing a little bit of something, which is very nice to be able to do it oneself. But look, I mean, life is short and resources are limited, so maybe we should forget about the art of writing, have handwriting. We don't need it. We can, because these...
How many people think that's true?
It's an interesting proposition.
It is, and I've never thought of that.
Is everyone always going to have that technology with them, though?
Okay,
That's
very.
the question, I
Yeah.
guess.
You know, the last vestige of writing is signing your name to a check or form, but nobody asks you to do that anymore.
Yeah, mobile banking.
Yeah, I mean, you just show your little icon, or say, click here and this constitutes my signature.
Right.
I
Right.
guess
So I
access
think,
would
you know, I
be
think that's probably,
solution.
it is something.
Right,
In
right.
fact, if you ask school teachers, of course, they know that that's already happening,
Yeah.
Right.
because kids don't know how to write
Digital
That's
code.
right.
Yeah.
as well as they used to.
But then if I may add, one thing, first of all, there's this idea that sometimes technology fails disastrously, and that's always going to happen. I mean, there's never ever going to be a situation in which we're absolutely sure that technology is not going to fail. So in those cases, there are a number of things that we still should be able to do, right? So maybe communicating with my wife is not one of them, but yeah, right. But the other things where obviously we should be able to still do it by with our own means, unaided by technology. So that's one thing. And the other thing is that I think that there are a number of things that we should really have at the tip of our tongues or the tip of our fingers. That even the mediation of looking things up on our Palm head or whatever is too slow a method. We just need to be able to immediately shoot a response. For example, take, I mean, it's obvious, but take safety or security gestures, for example, on an airport, the sort of things that the guys have to do and not to do, otherwise people's lives or equipment are in danger. You don't see them sort of look up. When I'm backing with my thing, I shouldn't do this, or I shouldn't go that fast. I mean, it has to be completely ingrained and become completely automatized. And that's, I mean, the lookup method is not going to work for everything. That's one thing. And the other thing is there are a number of facts, I think, that we need to have somehow assimilated to such a degree that they continue to do the work in our minds. If they're always out there, we're not going to assimilate and combine and build it into a real expert skill. Yes, I am. Yeah, it's true.
But you know, it raises to me one of the big research issues, which I will never do, but it sounds to me like your group might be interested in. We occasionally talk about it here, but we generally, I think, do not. Although I would bet that everybody in this room, the most significant general skill that I think is used in graduate school or education today is judging the credibility of information.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And because we are overwhelmed with information,
Right.
and access to the internet has expanded this tremendously.
Right.
So the skill that I think is incredibly difficult for teachers to teach, and even for learners to learn. In fact, we don't even know how to describe what I'm talking about.
Right.
And yet everybody here knows what I'm talking about, is how to discern good information from mediocre information, from downright incorrect information.
Right.
And how do you know, that's an interesting philosophical issue, linguistic issue. It gets at your point also of, you know, what are facts? You said you have to know a certain number of facts. I think implicitly you were saying what I was saying. That is, you have to know enough to know what is blatantly incorrect.
Exactly.
Like, you know,
Right.
George Bush did not live in the 18th century. He may have acted like he was,
Right.
but he wasn't. You have to know a few basic
That's
things in order to, and that's just one example of huge numbers. And how do you, you know, moving forward, and if you think about the whole world, that is in many ways the global instructional challenge, I think, and yet we don't. We don't even know how to talk about it well.
Well, yes.
If I can just jump in
Please.
for a second. So this is more, how do computers know credibility of information? But that
I was saying,
problem was,
how do you know?
yeah, but a different problem is how do computers know the credibility of information?
Yeah.
And that was solved more or less through one of these examples of co-option. So the reason that Google search, you know, is so much better than its predecessors is because it co-opted the hyperlink relationships among pages in order to learn what information should you trust or weight more heavily. So they co-opted something that already existed, the internet, and
Good example.
link relationships, and then they found a way to teach computers how to know the credibility of web pages, which had been an unsolved problem and has been very, very disruptive and transformative. And you know, one example of how it's been disruptive is that we now are able to think about you know, not relying on knowing everything, but we can just resort to Googling something, and it's now so quick, and you get to the fact you want so quickly that it's now even possible to think about, well, do we even need to know facts?
But is it credibility or popularity?
I mean, they would argue that it's credibility, and I mean, it's not exactly credibility, it's, you know, an approximation to credibility, but it's basically sufficient for most practical purposes.
Well, they're related in this instance. It's the relationship between popular.
Yeah.
Yeah. But it's a little bit like Wikipedia, too.
Yeah, I was about
That
to
is,
mention
you have enough
Wikipedia.
examples and enough people
Right.
saying, I think this is true, that, that Wikipedia bets on what most people say is the mean answer to the question. You know, 2 + 2 =.
Yeah.
But everyone used
But
to
w-
believe the world was flat.
Yeah.
There
Wikipedia.
you go.
Now, Wikipedia is an enormously interesting. The thing about Google is that, of course, there's this page ranking thing, but of course there are lots of secrets. But I'm not a specialist of Google, but I use it a lot, and I'm sure there are other sort of algorithms and things behind the Google magic, and they're not telling us because, you know, it's money. So I've heard so much about the algorithm that you're talking about, and I don't doubt that it's a crucial idea. It's a tremendous example of co-opting, and it works. But I think there are other secrets behind Google. Now, Wikipedia in that way is more interesting, maybe because there it's entirely transparent, almost entirely transparent. And as a result, there's quite a bit of scientific investigation of the Wikipedia procedure, and it's much more complicated than you think. I don't want to go into the details. Also, many of them have evaporated, but I have a close collaborator and friend who's actually working for the Wikipedia Foundation in San Francisco, and through him I have been introduced to some of the complexities of how articles, I mean, there's a whole typology of processes of checking, counter-checking, with hierarchical authority and trust, and a dynamical evolution of what articles end up as an article, what articles end up being eliminated, and so on and so forth, the stabilization of this extremely complex, dynamical, interactive process. So Wikipedia is a really interesting source. It also shows that it cannot be simply self-organized and bottom-up. There's some top-down control of the process. It's an extremely subtle mix of bottom-up and top-down. The other thing I wanted to say is that we're, again, in a typical situation where maybe the philosopher's role, but he can't do it in just one talk, is to sort of bring together areas which don't know exist. Various areas are developed. For example, authority and trust on the internet is a huge field. And there are concepts and people discuss and they're making progress and so on. I'm not saying that it's immediately usable, but it exists. And it's part of a wider field which is called social epistemology, which is basically the both conceptual and empirical multidisciplinary study of the distribution of knowledge and cognition in a community, science being one example, but many other things, expert skills in certain areas, and the internet and so on. Again, I mean, there are linguists, philosophers, anthropologists, economists, and so on, working and producing interesting knowledge and concept, but they're interesting and difficult. So how are you going to sort of translate this stuff? I mean, we only have one life, each of us. So how are you going to somehow translate this stuff? Make the people like yourself or others in the audience aware that this exists? Okay, so that's step one. And second, well, now that they know that it exists, what can they do with it? How is it usable? And that's difficult.
Yeah,
A philosopher can help.
I was just thinking, related to your comment, is that in many ways, it's probably that Google has colonized us
Mm-hmm.
So my comment about judging credibility, it wouldn't be an issue if we didn't have so much stuff that we could tap into so quickly
Right.
that then we have to make decisions about.
Yeah.
You know, it used to be that if it was published in a book by a number of the 10 top book publishers in America, you'd say, oh, it must be true.
Right.
It's by Professor Andler. It must be, you know, published by Prentice Hall. It must
Yes.
be true.
Exactly.
Now, nobody will buy the book. They'll just go on Google, and
Right.
it may hit you or it may hit
That's right.
somebody else, and we don't know who to believe.
Yeah.
Except that Google sort of hints at it by giving us a ranking where it pops up.
That's right.
Anyway, I think that we probably pushed the limits of our brains and the time.
Okay.
that we have. People are welcome to stay afterwards. I want to thank you. The size of the audience has no bearing on the quality of the presentation.
I'm sorry, I was a little
So,
low. Okay, but the discussion was
ran into
very...
a beautiful day. And people in Philadelphia